Alright, back to this. There was something I forgot to mention. So there's some problems with the biochar thing, right? So I kind of alluded to the fact that it's not really the right scale, but notice what they're doing here. This sounds good on the surface, right? So they're helping prevent wildfires by removing flammable trees. But look at this claim here. Promotes biodiversity. Removing dead trees. What you really want in a nice healthy forest is some dead rotting trees to provide habitat for things like fungus, insects, small mammals, mosses, lichens, all sorts of things. By removing all of that, you actually decrease biodiversity. Okay, so there's a problem there. And like I mentioned, so we're using a cutting-edge process to turn the tree biomass into biochar. Okay, so the scale of this is too small for sure. What we should be doing is if you can do this at scale, right, where you can turn carbonaceous material into charcoal and have a net negative carbon footprint doing that, right? So you end up producing more charcoal. More carbon is in that charcoal by mass than you released into the atmosphere with the heating of it to cause the pyrolysis. Then you can do that with other materials besides trees, which means you can do it with things like plastic and paper trash. And if you do it with things like plastic and paper trash, guess what's no longer going into the ocean? Or guess what we can collect out of the ocean and just do this to it? And now it's not in the ocean. And then we can put it into the soil. Oh my God, look at that. That's a better project. It's not what we're doing. I think what happened is you have a dude sitting in Starbucks for 10 minutes and his boss was like, hey, come up with 5 ideas by the end of your break. And he's like, oh, okay. And he came up with this one. And if that's how he came up with it, it's a good idea. I like it. If more thought than that went into it, this is not a good idea anymore. Because this is so superficial that if it took more than that amount of effort to come up with this, wow, you did not do your job. Keep in mind, they're asking for money. They're asking you to pay for this. Now over here, the mineral weathering thing. Okay, so as long as the basalt is actually exposed and being weathered, yeah, it'll work. But if the basalt becomes buried and it's no longer getting weathered, it doesn't really work so well anymore because it's not being exposed to anything that's causing it to change, right? And you're going to have to put so much basalt out that basically you're snuffing out this process that's going to weather it because you're just having to put out so much material that either it has to cover a ridiculously huge surface area or it's burying itself and protecting itself from weathering, which completely defeats the purpose. Something that would work better, right? Because the thing that they're doing is they're producing calcium carbonate. That's the ultimate goal of this, right? So something that would work better would be, what about chicken farming or quail farming like I do? My quail, one of the main things that they do for me is they lay eggs, right? Now, most of those eggs I eat, okay? And a few of them I will hatch to get more quail for the next season. The eggshell is calcium carbonate, and then the membrane has some protein in it. So what I do is I will allow the eggshells to dry out after consuming the egg. Just let the eggshell dry out, and then like crush it, and then grind it down into a pretty fine grit. And for the most part, some of it I'll feed back to the quail, but for the most part, that will actually go onto the yard, where it serves as grit for the earthworms in my soil. And it does a couple things, because the calcium carbonate, they use it in their gizzard to break down food, and then they excrete it as part of the soil. So now you have this relatively permanent sequestered carbon in the soil, in a pretty stable form. But it also, the membrane, recall, has some proteins in it, which actually helps it helps the worms grow, and it helps them reproduce, and it helps them produce castings that are more nutritious for other microorganisms, bacteria, other little dudes. There's all kinds of little bugs and shit. I don't understand the full what's going on there, but because I do this and a few other things, there are a lot of nutrients in my soil, and they are actually helping to sequester carbon from the atmosphere constantly. Because one of the things that will happen is, so all of this is going on, and it's making the soil better for plants to grow in. It's making the important nutrients more accessible to the plants. It's allowing the soil to hold water better, which is good for the plants. And then as the plants grow, their normal growth cycle includes a period where the plant is producing excess amounts of sugar and excreting it into the soil to feed the microbiota in the soil. Okay? So what this is doing is it is actually introducing carbon into the soil. And then what happens is, when you harvest the plant at a later period, before it has actually reclaimed most of that, and it can't reclaim all of it. It's not possible for it to reclaim all of it, so it's always going to sequester some in this manner. But if you harvest it at the right time before it has reclaimed most of that, what ends up happening is you get an appreciable amount of carbon sequestered in the soil due to this, and it is carbon which is contributing to biomass. So you are increasing the amount of life in the soil, which helps make the soil more stable. And along with all of this, I'm introducing calcium carbonate as one of my steps because of the quail that I raise. This is a much better way to do this, right? Because we're improving the soil and we're sequestering carbon in multiple ways, and they kind of play into each other. And another thing that I want to do, but so far I have failed, I've not been able to do this, and it's mostly because I ordered at the wrong time of year so far. I want to start raising clams. And one of the things, the way that this works, I think this is nice. So we get lots of sun here. So it's real easy to grow things like algae, particularly nitrogen-fixing algae, which require virtually nothing other than water with a decent amount of surface area. That's really about it, because they're going to use a lot of oxygen, and they're going to be fixing, So the clams need a lot of oxygen, but the cyanobacteria, the algae, needs exposure to nitrogen from the atmosphere. Okay, and then the clams will eat the algae. They'll filter feed the algae out of the water, and they will take that nitrogen and carbon from the atmosphere that the cyanobacteria is collecting. So your algae is taking both carbon and nitrogen from the atmosphere, and converting them into useful things like sugars and other carbohydrates, and ammonia and urea, nitrites, things like that, amino acids, etc., that the clams can use to grow. And then the clams will pull calcium ions out of the water, and they will, with some of that carbon that they're getting, they will produce calcium carbonate as their shells. And then after, if you get like a fast-growing clam variety, after a few months, you have an edible clam that you get food out of, and you have a shell now that is effectively identical to this permanent store of carbon, right? Because it is exactly the same material that they're trying to produce with weathered basalt. But again, what this does is it adds to the biomass of the ecosystem. It actually produces food for people, which now, like, I have even more food that I can just collect. And, this is something you could grow clams in a frickin' apartment. Right? You don't need a lot of space for this. You can grow clams in a little tiny aquarium, right? So this is a way that you can sequester carbon in a relatively permanent way very, very quickly, more quickly than you can with crushed basalt, right? So just, clean your tap water and put that in. As long as you have reasonably hard tap water, which even soft tap water is pretty hard. It's hard enough for this purpose. As long as there's calcium ions in that water, the clams can build their shells, and hey, look at that. You're sequestering carbon now with the clams. And the nice thing about the clams is they will grow to whatever population size can be sustained by what you're feeding them. And if you're feeding them something that's just being sustained on sunlight, oh my god, that's fucking free. Like, this is a really, really awesome solar-powered way to sequester carbon in an equally permanent manner to this crushed basalt thing. And it produces food. It produces food for you. So, I'm not impressed with these things that they have. I'm not going to say that they're wrong. I'm sure these things work to a degree, but I'm not impressed. I wouldn't put money into this.